It's my pleasure to kick off our next session here with two fantastic scholars from the Penn Museum here. If you have some extra time today or tomorrow, the Penn Museum is a wonderful place. New Middle East galleries, lots of new stuff going on over at the Penn Museum. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll introduce our first speaker, William Wierzbowski, who's the keeper of the American section at the Penn Museum here. For 30 years, he's worked with Native American art and material culture in both a curatorial capacity and as a scholar. And he's had a number of exhibits over the years, which I won't list, except if folks remember the amazing Images of a Vanished Life Plains Indian Drawings, which was at PAFA some years ago. Within the broad context of Native American art, his research is focused on the tradition of Plains Indian drawing and painting, especially ledger drawing, and the history of collecting Native American material culture, which he's lectured on both here and nationally. It's our pleasure to welcome him today to speak about Earth Woman, the Kip Connection.
Good afternoon, yes. It's a real pleasure to be here, even just walking across campus a little bit. Before I really launch into things, I just want to, acknowledge the fact that we meet here in what was the homeland of the Lenape people. And the names that you find, those of you who aren't from this area, the names you find scattered throughout Philadelphia and the surrounding area of the Delaware Valley still ring with the sound, of that Algonquian tongue, Conshohocken, Kingsessing, Lahaska, Maniank, Moyamensing, Neshaminy, Nakamexin. So just be aware of that. I'd also like to acknowledge the amazing work done on piecing together the life and times of James Kip and his family by a colleague whom I've never met but have corresponded with over the years, W. Raymond Wood, who's professor emeritus at the University of Missouri, Columbia. I have drawn heavily on his work for this presentation, but it's also gratifying to know that I can take it a bit further because I have access to the actual object that Earth Woman made. I'd also like to thank Lynn and John for inviting me to do this, and for the opportunity to present some of the research that I've been engaged in with another colleague, Pam Jardine, on Charles Stevens and his remarkable collection that is part of the American collections at the museum. This is in anticipation of an exhibit that we are working on, which will materialize in a couple of years. So that said, much of what I'm going to say should be viewed here as definitely a work in progress. And it's one of the many great stories that's going to be told through this collection about the incredible relationships between native and non-native peoples, specifically on the Blackfeet Reservation in 1891. So outside of Earth Woman, who you see on the left slide, actually it's a cropped slide. That's the full photograph. That photograph was taken in 1891, and that is the robe in question, the quilled buffalo robe that she did. Outside of Earth Woman, the other most important, you'll recognize a few names that'll pop up. George Bird Grinnell, a famous anthropologist who worked among the Blackfeet in the 1890s. James Willard Schertz, who was an author. And another gentleman whose name is escaping me, Emerson Howe. Outside of those folks who are, potentially well-known. The most important person outside of Earth Woman in this presentation is the fairly unknown Philadelphia artist, Charles Hallowell Stevens, through whose hands this buffalo robe arrived here in Philadelphia. So, in keeping with the title of the exhibition, let's see, well, place ourselves geographically. In keeping with the title of the exhibition, Okay, I'll Do It Myself, I thought I'd begin by reading a few lines about Native American women of the Northern Plains, written, of course, by a man. I have often heard and read that Indian women received no consideration from their husbands and led a life of exceedingly hard and thankless work that is very wide of the truth so far as the natives of the Northern Plains were concerned. It is true that the women gathered fuel for the lodge, bundles of dry willow or limbs from fallen cottonwood. They also did the cooking, and besides tanning robes, converted the skins of deer, elk, antelope, and mountain sheep into soft buckskin for family use. But never a one of them suffered from overwork. When they felt like it, they rested. They realized there were other days coming, and they took their time about anything they had to do. Their husbands never interfered with them any more than they did with him in his task of providing hides and skins and meat, the staff of life. The majority, nearly all of them, were naturally industrious and took pride in their work. They joyed in putting away parflesh after parflesh of choice dried meats and pemmican, in tanning soft robes and buckskins for home use or sale, in embroidering wonderful patterns of beads or colored porcupine quills upon moccasin tops, dresses, leggings, and saddle trappings. When robes were to be traded, they got their share of the proceeds. They bought blankets and red and blue trade cloth, vermilion, beads, bright prints, and various other articles of use and adornment. This quote is from a book titled My Life as an Indian, written in 1907 by James Willard Schultz, conservationist, historian, prolific author of 37 books. It was written many years after he arrived in Montana from New York as a young man in 1877. All those years in Montana were spent living on the reservation with the Pikuni, or Pigan, as I will refer to them going forward, a subgroup of the Blackfeet. Schultz married a young Pigan woman, Nataki, who was a survivor of the Baker Massacre in 1870. He wrote from long experience of life on the reservation and immersion in Blackfeet culture. Schultz is also one of the two writers, the other being Emerson Howe, through whose writings we know the scant details of the life of Sakuyaki, or Earth Woman, and her son, Joseph Kipp. The story, and indeed life of Earth Woman, encapsulates the story of the relationship between the native peoples of the lands west of the Mississippi and the United States, a tale that began as equal meeting equal with the Lewis and Clark expedition, which in less than a century turned to one of complete domination of one by the other. From her birth in 1818 until her death in 1910, Earth Woman witnessed at firsthand, first among her own people, the Mandan, and then among the Blackfeet. So just quickly, the map on your right is the Upper Missouri, the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Earth Lodge villages lie at that big bend. And on the right, or on the left, I'm sorry, is the current state of Montana, with the Blackfeet Reservation designated up in the northwest corner. James Kipp, the husband of Earth Woman and father of Joseph Kipp, joined the Columbia Fur Company in St. Louis in 1822 and was charged with reviving the trade with the Mandan, one of the three settled village groups at the westward bend of the Missouri River. The other two groups were the Arikara and the Hidatsa. The Fur Company then merged with the American Fur Company in 1827, and the newly created one was named Upper Missouri Outfit. Kipp became responsible for Fort Clark, the outfit's trading post near the Mandan village, in 1831. While in Mandan country, Kipp took a country wife, as they were called, a native woman, as a way of cementing the relationship between the Mandan and himself, meaning the company. It was at Fort Clark that Kipp met both the American painter George Catlin in 1832 and the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer in 1883, who was the artist on Prince Maximilian's expedition The Catlin image is on your left, and the Bodmer image on your right. In both cases, they were following the same route that Lewis and Clark had taken. Kip, who spoke Mandan fluently, according to Maximilian, became indispensable to both Catlin, the prince, and Bodmer for the access to the individuals, ceremonies, and information he was able to provide. Both Catlin and Maximilian published extensive volumes after those journeys, and the visual record left by both Bodmer and Catlin are incredibly rich in detail. The ethnological information we have about these village groups in the early 19th century would be much less substantial were it not for James Kip and his relationship with the Mandan. So these two images, the one by Catlin, the one by Bodmer, actually are images of the same gentleman whose name was Mato Tope, Forebears, who was the second chief of the Mandan. Earth Woman was born to Mato Tope and the second chief of the Mandan, and most likely his favorite wife, whose name was Mink, in the year 1818. And this is a portrait of Mink on the left that was done by George Catlin. Schultz remarks that, quote, "I believe that Sakyaki was born in the 1820s, as she often told me that she was a girl of 10 or 12 winters when Catlin visited her people." The smallpox epidemic of 1837, which decimated the populations of the Earth Lodge village groups, and in that smallpox epidemic, Matotope died. So Earth Woman and her two siblings went to live with a non-related Mandan woman. Eventually, they all moved to a new palisaded Earth Lodge village built by the Hidatsa in 1845, named like a fishhook village. Remnants of the Arikara also abandoned their original village and moved to like a fishhook. The Upper Missouri outfit followed suit and built a trading fort on the north side of the new village and named it Fort Berthold, the name it still holds today, the reservation name. It was also here at Like a Fishhook Village that James Kip, who came to run the fort, took another country wife after his first had died. This second wife was Earth Woman. Their only child, Joseph, was born on November 29, 1849, when Earth Woman was 31 years old. When James Kip retired from the company in 1859, he left Fort Berthold to return downriver to his real wife, Mary, who lived on the farm they had purchased years before in Berry, Kansas. Kip left Earth Woman and 10-year-old Joseph behind at Like a Fishhook Village, where Joseph grew into manhood as a mixed blood. So again, it's the image of Earth Woman on the left, and a photograph of Joseph Kip, her son, taken in Blackfeet country sometime in the 1890s. Joseph appears to have had some formal education downriver in St. Joseph, Missouri, but spent most of his life in the upper Missouri River region, eventually moving to Montana around Fort Benton, and later as a licensed trader and storekeeper on the Blackfeet Reservation. Joseph took his mother, Earth Woman, with him, and she does appear on the 1860 census rolls for Montana Territory. In 1870, Joe Kip served as an Army scout for Colonel E.M. Baker, who was searching for a band of outlaw Piegan. Kip mistakenly led the troops to the camp of the peaceful and friendly band of Chief Heavy Runner. By the time Kip realized his mistake, it was too late. Ever since, the event has been known as the Baker Massacre. Joseph Kip later married Martha Heavy Runner, the chief's surviving daughter of that massacre, with whom he had 4 children. And Kip was given the Blackfeet name, which translates as Raven Quiver. There are quite a few Kips on the Blackfeet Reservation currently, and one of our goals is to actually get in touch with a lot of these people as we move forward with this exhibition. Here is a painting by Russell in 1898 of the interior of Kip's trading post on that res. And a photograph from the 1890s. On the left is the interior of Kip's post. And on the right is a photograph showing Kip's water system. Evidently, much of the water source on the Blackfeet res itself was poisoned at some point, and so water had to be brought in by train. And this was the manner in which Kip moved it from the train to the rest of the res. As mentioned earlier, James Willard Schultz arrived at Fort Benton in 1877, where he was befriended by Joe Kip and Earth Woman almost immediately. In that 1907 book, My Life as an Indian, Joseph Kip is identified simply as Barry, and Earth Woman as Mrs. Barry Sr., because, of course, Joe Kip was married. So Schultz gives a delightful physical description of Earth Woman. Mrs. Barry Sr. was a full-blooded Mandan, but very light-colored and brown-haired. She was tall and slender, very good-looking, very proud and dignified, but of great kindness of heart. In another publication, Schultz wrote, Mrs. James Kip, Sakwiyaki, Earth Woman, as I, and in common with the Blackfeet, love to call her, was a woman of most noble character and kindly disposition. I cannot speak too highly of her. She was a second mother to me in the days of my youth on the Buffalo Plains. She was a friend to all of the poor and afflicted, white and red, as was her inseparable companion, an Arikari woman named Crow Woman. Her kindness and generosity were further praised and lauded in yet another one of Schultz's publications. Quote, came the winter of 1881-82, actually it should have been 82-83, the dreadful starvation winter of the southern Pagan. More than 500 died from want of food. Although not kin to the Blackfeet, these two noble women did all they could to alleviate their distress. They spent all of their savings of years in buying food for them and kept life in many an emaciated man, woman, and child until the authorities came to their relief in the spring. Moving to the really interesting part. This is a photograph of Charles Stevens, the artist, from 1891, taken on the Blackfeet res. The gentleman behind him with the pipe tomahawk and the traditional war bonnet is Eagle Ribs, who was the gentleman who ultimately adopted Charles Stevens in the course of the 3 months that he was on the reservation. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, Philadelphia had become a nexus for all things related to Native Americans. Those decades had seen the defeat of the U.S. Army at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the massacre at Wounded Knee, and the rise of the Wild West shows, largest and most famous of which were those of Buffalo Bill and Pawnee Bill. Other factors also contributed, three in particular. First, the rise of anthropology as an academic discipline grounded in museums such as the Penn Museum, which was founded in 1887, and also the Academy of Natural Sciences here in Philadelphia, which did have a division of archaeology and ethnology. That division is now closed and has been for pretty much the run of the 20th century. Secondly, the growth of national watchdog organizations such as the Indian Rights Association and Indian Hope Association, which monitored conditions on the reservations. The Indian Rights Association was based here in Philadelphia. Third, the existence of a number of private collections of American Indian art and material culture right here in Philadelphia. So Charles Stevens and his wife, whose name was Alice Barber Stevens, met as students at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts here in Philadelphia, where they trained with the painter Thomas Akins. As a young man, Charles joined the Philadelphia Sketch Club in the 1870s, the only club for artists in Philadelphia, and one whose membership was exclusively male. In 1876, both Charles and Alice entered the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Alice completed her studies in 1880, and Charles in 1882. Charles then taught painting and drawing at the Academy from 1889 to 1891. Like a number of his fellow artists in Philadelphia at the time, Stevens became a collector of Native American art. He had already collected briefly among the Seminole in Florida in 1876 and among the Iroquois in New York by 1880. Some of those artist colleagues had participated in the 1890 census of Native Americans living on the reservations, which was supervised by Thomas Corwin Donaldson, another Philadelphian, who had a major collection of Native American art, which is now curated at the Penn Museum. The resulting publication in 1891, titled Census of American Indians Taxed and Not Taxed, was illustrated by drawings and paintings done by a number of those artists, and in some cases by photographs that they took while so engaged on specific reservations. Stevens also knew the leading anthropologists and Native American specialists of the day, including Daniel Brinton, who was the founder of the University of Pennsylvania's anthropology department, Stuart Cullen, the curator of the American section and director of the Free Museum of Science and Art, which is now the Penn Museum, and Frank Hamilton Cushing, who was also associated with the museum and directed its excavations at Key Marco in Florida. As a cradle Quaker, Stevens was also associated with the Indian Rights Association. In fact, the Quaker community in Philadelphia was heavily involved in the relief efforts during the starvation winter that I had mentioned of 1883-84 in Blackfeet country, when 500 Piegan perished due to the inadequate supply of government rations during that particularly brutal winter. All these factors combined led Charles Stevens to the decision to travel to the Blackfeet Reservation in western Montana. At age 36, just a few months after his marriage to Alice in 1891, Stevens left for Montana for the summer. Herbert Welsh of the Indian Rights Association here in Philadelphia wrote to George Steele, the agent on the Blackfeet Reservation, to secure the necessary permission for Stevens' stay, which lasted 3 months. So you will see in this delegation photo of the Piegan Band in Washington in 1891, Agent Steele is up at the very top, would be the second one in, and actually Joe Kipp is at the very far end wearing the other hat. During that stay, Stevens lived with the Piegan Band, who were considered the most traditional and were said to have retained many of their old customs. He made an effort to befriend tribal members, including a number of Piegan men. Stevens made a comprehensive and well-documented collection of 200 objects of Piegan material culture, a discrete collection within his much larger collection of 1,400 objects. He also kept a journal in which he recorded ceremonies he observed and information about customs, many enhanced by sketches. In addition, Stevens also documented reservation life with his camera. He had studied photography with Akins at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. There are more than 200 albumen photographs showing candid portrayals of the daily life and ceremonies of the Piegan. He was adopted into the tribe by the young man Eagle Ribs, whom you saw earlier, and he was given the name Asin-Aki, or picture maker, because he was constantly drawing in his journal and taking photographs. And so just a few examples of objects that he, in fact, bought from specific, he either bought or were gifted to him. The gentleman on the left of the photograph on the left is Big Beaver. That was his tobacco bag that Stevens obtained from him. This is Stevens' catalog card, and you can see that he bought it on July, it looks like, what, 1891. He bought it from Big Beaver for $1, and then on the reverse, he actually did a drawing of the piece. Another gentleman is Three Sons, who was one of the major chiefs of that Piegan Band, actually gifted this cartridge bag to Charles Stevens, and again, his catalog card and his drawing of the piece. Although not a Piegan object, the quilled buffalo robe made by Sakuiaki, Earth Woman, was also acquired by Charles Stevens during his stay on the reservation in 1891. He obtained it from Dr. John E. Jenkins, the reservation doctor. Jenkins had asked Stephen to paint a portrait of his wife in exchange for the robe. The doctor had, in fact, earlier traded his medical services for the robe. Joe Kipp owed Jenkins $105 and paid the bill with the robe that his mother had quilled, which I think is actually kind of a very sweet story. So, again, the photo of Earth Woman, Sakuiaki. The two people standing next to her, husband and wife, right off the hand, I can't remember their names. The gentleman was a partner with Joe Kipp in one of the shops or trading operations that he ran. There are two references to Earth Woman's use of porcupine quills and beads in her work. One is from, again, James Willard Schultz, who says, quote, both Sakuiaki and Crow Woman did beautiful embroidery with colored porcupine quills. The other is from Emerson Howe, who wrote, not quite as lovingly as Schultz did, the old lady has a little house of her own where she does her beadwork and keeps her dried meat after the fashion of her earlier life. Joseph Kipp took tender care of his old mother. So what I'm showing you here are actually some quill working tools, since the two pieces we're going to look at very quickly are both quilled, and both quilled by Bird Woman. On your right is an awl case, which every woman would have had suspended from her belt, which contained an awl, which was used for making the holds in the hide for the quilling process. On the left, actually, is not a Blackfeet piece. This is a Lakota piece. It is a buffalo bladder bag, and above it are the dyed porcupine quills that actually were in the bag. Be very sharp and dangerous. So these are the two pieces, in fact, that Earth Woman quilled. The robe in question on your left that was used to pay for medical services, and then had another life by having a painting done for it. And on the right, actually, a pair of quilled moccasins that Earth Woman made in 1895, which were purchased by George Bird Grinnell, who was on the Blackfeet Res, and they reside at the Yale Peabody Museum at the moment. What? What's that? You're going to acquire them? I don't think. No, I think we have to. We just have to kind of do a raid. So the quilled robe by Sakuiaki, and actually another image on your right, painting by Carl Bodmer, of a Hidatsa man wearing a very similar type robe. This would have been done in 1833. This is actually a male. The design on it is a design that would be worn or would be put on a robe that a man would wear. And as another example, these two pieces are in our collection here at the museum also. The one on the left actually was made by Mrs. Charging Thunder, a Lakota woman, so we know her name. They were painted in 1882, but this is the painted version of that quilled robe. And what I did was, the one on the right, or on the left, actually is that male pattern again. The one on the right is a pattern that would be worn, that appears on robes worn by women. So just as a comparative. So this is the front and the back of the robe as it's laid out, and it's good size. There was a 5-month period between November and March, which was the optimum time for obtaining hides that had the hair left on, because these would have been winter robes. Because the winter fur of the buffalo was deemed the most suitable at this 5-month period. Also, it was robes made from the hides of buffalo cows and buffalo calves, which was prized. The hides of buffalo bulls were generally too thick and too heavy. Hides are fully dressed and tanned, and it would have taken a woman an average of 10 days to process a hide, which involved multiple processes. This is a photograph from the Blackfeet Res in 1915 showing a woman, basically the hide is staked down to the ground and she's scraping the flesh off, basically, which was only one part of the process. Because again, it involved stretching, defleshing, brain tanning, softening, smoking. It's a 10-day process. I think we got a couple details here. Oops. So this robe, in this particular robe, Earth Woman used 2 different techniques for porcupine quilling. They're both, I'm going to say they're simple, but they're not simple. One is called simple, and I'll do the detail, the better detail. So the one technique shows, it's called the simple band using 2 threads. So basically you have 2 threads of sinew that are running parallel, and it's a single porcupine quill that's brought up and put down, brought up, stitched down, brought up, stitched down, and then you can tack the ends of it underneath, which then gives you that kind of flat appearance. And I tried to get a larger close-up of the damaged part because you can actually see the technique quite well. The other technique that she uses in this is the dead center of the circle, which is just called a simple line. So it's basically 1 thread of sinew and it's 1 porcupine quill. And you're wrapping the quill around it and tacking it down, wrapping it around, so you get this kind of loop-like quality. And that's the kind of thing that's used for outlining. Oh, I actually have the diagrams. So the diagram on your left, actually, the 3rd one down at the very left, shows the simple parallel bands of sinew with the quill being just kind of wrapped over and then tacked down. And then 2 above it in the upper corner, you see that the single stitch line. Earth Woman actually, when she did do this pair of moccasins for Grinnell, she actually used a different technique, which is basically called 2-quill diamond. So you still have the 2 parallel lines of sinew going, but you've got 2 quills going simultaneously. And what they do is they cross over, they bend, and they cross over. So what winds up happening is you get this really wonderful kind of geometry, or this diamond-shaped design, which is it's a much more labor-intensive way of quilling. The other is very much quicker. And finally, we figured out that this photograph, which was unidentified, it's in private hands. It's in the hands of the daughter of the husband and wife. So this is a bad reproduction of the photograph. But we really think that this is a photograph that was taken by Charles Stevens in 1891 when he was there. When you compare it to the rest of the photographs in that collection, and the fact that he really did attempt to photograph everyone that he got material from. And he would have met Sakyaki, and so this actually, the photograph did wind up in the hands of maybe not necessarily the sitter, but it stayed out in, on the reservations because we don't have a copy of this one. So, so that's where it lies at the moment. And as I said, we're going to, as we're moving ahead, we're going to be doing a lot of work with the folks on the res, and hopefully we can make this a much richer story. But I think it's a great story anyway. So.
Thank you so much, Bill. We're going to press on, and I have the pleasure to introduce Lucy Fowler Williams, the Associate Curator and Senior Keeper of American Collections, also here at Penn. She's won a variety of grants and fellowships for her work on Native American voices and material culture. If you have a chance to go to the Penn Museum, she was instrumental in the Native American section of, just as you walk into the left of the museum. Her research interests include indigenous identity, history of collecting, and representations of material culture. And it's my pleasure to welcome her talking about weaving the spirit of Alaska.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here, and really want to thank Lynn and John specifically for inviting me, and Bill as well, to come over and share something of what we've got a couple of blocks away here with you today. And I hope you don't hear my stomach growling. I'm sorry we're a little bit delayed, but it seems like we're going to just press on. So I'll do my best to sort of speed it up a bit. I'm sort of technically challenged working from a laptop and this screen, so if I get confused, I apologize, but I'll do my best. Let's see. Okay, so my paper this afternoon introduces a master Native Alaskan fiber artist named Terry Rothkar, a Tlingit weaver of spruce root baskets and raven-tailed dancing blankets, and she's from Southeast Alaska. So this is between south of Anchorage, north of Vancouver, all the islands in that area. I met Terry 16 years ago when she came to do research at the Penn Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology on our very strong historic Tlingit collections from her home communities of Sitka and Hoona in that southeast region. And so in the next couple of minutes, what I'd like to do is introduce Terry's background, her art and her practice, her special gifts as a teacher. And I also want to give you a sense of the national and international recognition that she's achieved. But what I really want to do is to try to convey and emphasize a kind of very special spirituality that comes across so strongly in Terry's work. And this happens through her connections to place and by always amplifying what she calls the life forces of her materials that she uses in her art. This makes her work incredibly vital, and it points out the remarkable role of materiality in the healing that is going on in the Tlingit communities today. Okay, John. The right, okay, I just need to do it more firmly. Thank you. Okay, so here's a map of Southeast Alaska. And what we're going to do is focus on the northern Tlingit region, the communities that are about 100 to 200 miles west of Juneau, which is that red dot there, the upper red dot. So west of that region and north of that region. And in Glacier Bay National Park, and the mountain just to the north of that, Mount Fairweather. And I'm going to be mentioning the communities right near there, Pelican, Hoona, and Sitka, a little bit south on Baranof Island. And I'll also mention a special place called Latuya Bay, which is a place of origin for Terry's people. Okay, so family background. As a young girl, Terry grew up in Anchorage, the daughter of Marie Mork and a Scottish-American father. Her mother is Tlingit and a member of the Toktantan Raven Mount Fairweather House, aka the Snail House of Hoona, Alaska. Their name references their origins to the north near Mount Fairweather. And over the last 300 years, this family, this group or clan, has been pushed physically out of this region by Mount Fairweather, pushed out by the advancing glaciers of what is now Glacier Bay National Park and pushed to nearby communities where they've resettled in Hoonah and Pelican, with Pelican's on the outer coast. Hoonah is sort of on the interior, the town closer to Juneau. So Tlingit society is organized into two moieties or halves, ravens and eagles, and is matrilineal. So this means that the clan affiliation is passed down through the mother. So everything in Tlingit society is organized by the mother. The women are the lineal, sort of important lineage holders. The men, of course, do lots of the very public oratory and leading of lots of ceremonies and stuff like that. But Terry sort of ignores them. So we won't talk about the men in this presentation. Terry spent her summers with her grandmother, Eliza Mork, in the small fishing community of Pelican on the far outer edge of Chickagoff Island. Historically, her mother's family specialized in weaving, so they were weavers, but they also were healers, and they played leading roles in the community for that reason, in health and well-being. So Terry was exposed to basket making techniques as a very young girl by her grandmother, who wove small drinking cups and berry picking baskets and clam baskets. Sometimes she asked Terry around the age of 9 to stay inside to work on the basketry, and Terry really didn't always appreciate this as a young girl. She remembered that it was hard to sit there and not move, and to get her small fingers to twist the weft and the warp, around the warp, in what is called twining, to get one to come forward and to the front and the other to move to the back, and then to switch them. After high school, Terry met her husband, Dennis, and in 1976 they moved to Sitka, about 100 miles to the south of Hoonah and Pelican, where they raised their 3 children. Terry started weaving in her early 30s when her children were young, or in sort of the mid-80s, 1980s. She was introduced to the historic raven's tail form of blanket weaving in 1990. In 1996, Terry actually physically, on one of her many walks in the woods and along the coast, she physically stepped on a basketry fragment that had emerged out of the mud on Baranof Island, just south of Sitka. And she noticed that it was made with the very same techniques that she had learned from her grandmother so many years before. The basket was, in fact, carbon dated to nearly 5,000 years old. In this moment, Terry felt that she had been singled out, and it changed her life. It clarified her purpose, which she felt quite profoundly was to connect even more deeply with the weaving of her ancestors. She remembered her grandmother's stories about Mount Fairweather and Lituya Bay to the north, where her family originated. So a few years later, Terry's research brought her to Penn, here at the Penn Museum, where we have, in fact, an exceptional Tlingit collection, including one of the largest Tlingit basketry collections in the world, and the Snail House collection of 45 objects from her community in Hoonah. She knew that we housed the Louis Shotridge collection, one of the finest in the world, acquired in the late 19-teens and 20s, and she came here very specifically to see one robe called the Lituya Bay robe, referencing that place by Mount Fairweather, where her ancestors are from. And this is, in fact, a painted caribou hide robe from her clan's ancestral homeland. Her grandmother had told her stories about Lituya Bay, situated just north of Pelican. The collection, here's a photograph of Terry here in our storeroom. The collections were made at Penn in the early teens and 20s, when the United States government, of course, was requiring assimilation of American Indians and Alaska Natives in order to become American citizens. Penn hired a Tlingit curator, which is pretty amazing, to make collections for the Penn Museum. And this was the era also of salvage anthropology and the massive collecting efforts that filled museum institutions such as ours at Penn. Penn hired the Tlingit curator named Louis Shotridge. He worked for 20 years making collections for the Penn Museum. And today, of course, against all odds, we know that Native Americans and Native Alaskans have survived to some degree. Tlingit people of Southeast Alaska number today about 20,000 people. They make up several Northwest Coast tribal nations in roughly a dozen different communities scattered along those islands, closely related to their Haida and Tsimshian neighbors to the east and to the south. So when Terry arrived, my department in the American section was involved in discussions with 2 or 3 different Tlingit tribes at the time about repatriation. And while discussions were going on, we developed a loan program that made important clan regalia available to Tlingit communities for specific memorial funeral services. These are also known as potlatches. That word isn't used as often now. So that's another story that I am not going to get into today, but you may have questions. So Terry played a leading role in hosting our initial visits on this loan program in 2003 and 2004. And on those trips, she would pick us up after the long flight. It takes a long time to get there. She would pick us up from Philadelphia, the flight to Sitka. She would immediately take us into the woods. Here's a picture. Bill, you were actually in that photograph. I did that for you. And she would take us into the woods, and she would talk to the trees. Definitely. Long conversations to the trees. Trees that she has known for many years. Greeting them kindly. The Sitka spruce, the hemlock, the alder, the pine, and an occasional yellow cedar. Greeting each one, talking to them, showing us she also would show us the degraded salmon remains in the streams, reflecting on her deep relationship to nature as just one small element, herself as just one small element in the larger scheme of life. She was definitely teaching us. So Terry's fiber art. Terry's art continues to tell the history of her Tlingit ancestors today through narrative connections to places on the land and through materials, through names and through memory. Her work is imbued with the spirit of her ancestors' traditional knowledge. She deliberately retains this spirit through materials, through technique, through production, through design, and also through use. All of these elements help us understand how Tlingit material culture is more than art for the market, but really rather underscores the power of material objects to hold meaning and the important role that artists are playing today in revitalizing those traditions that bring healing and strength to community members. Terry did this especially through her practices of obtaining raw materials and by paying attention to the life forces retained in those materials. This is definitely a traditional approach. And then she has her many interesting, quirky little things that she does. She honored each of her baskets, for example, that she wove by filling them at least once with fresh berries. Let's see. There we go. Tlingit legends tell that the creator is the raven, was the raven who, through his crafty mind, thought elements into being. He stole the sun and the moon and the stars from his grandfather, the great raven, who lived above the Nass River to the south and divided night from day. He set the tides in order. He filled the streams with fresh water and scattered the eggs of the salmon and the trout so that the Tlingit could have food. A cloud woman, not the raven, but a cloud woman as the stories go, who lived in the sky, who married the sun, she wove the first basket, and the sun enlarged that basket and lowered it from the sky near Yakutat on the Alsek River just north of Mount Fairweather. So the first baskets were made by Yakutat women. This is the next village above Hoonah, right near Mount Fairweather. So Terry pulls the small roots of the Sitka spruce in the spring. She gently pulls the moss aside and pulls those roots. You see that long string in this girl's hands on the left. She packs a .44 Magnum revolver on her hip because she's doing this in the spring alongside the bears who are come out of hibernation and are digging things of their own. She goes into the woods for a few days at a time to do this work, and she pulls hundreds of feet of roots very gently. These are very small roots. These are not the big roots. She does it very gently and carefully, not so much as to hurt the trees. She immediately bundles those loosely and then burns them over the fire right there in the woods to pull the mold and the fungus out of the roots. And then comes the very long process of peeling the bark off of those very small roots. First by pulling them through a little notch, and you see her in the lower right doing this work. First by pulling them and then scraping and smoothing them, and then for hours splitting them in half and then in quarters again. All of this in preparation of the weaving. And remarkably, I just got back from Alaska, where I was in Glacier Bay in this region for a couple of weeks, and just so interestingly, Tlingit women, as they're traveling on the ferries, like in this photograph, are always doing this work. If you look very closely at the left elbow of the lady in red, you can see the knife and all the little fine shavings that she has taken off of the root that she is indeed splitting in half now. And on the left in the little Tupperware containers, you see little tiny bundles of roots that have already been split, organized by size, because Yarrow there is starting the foundation of a coiled basket, and she's working very carefully, trying to sort and keep the withes that she will use as a weft for her twining of about the same size. So here are two examples. Terry's new example of a copy of a piece, of an old piece in our collection, and the brightly colored fresh spruce root is the brighter, newer one on the right. So starting like the spokes of a wheel, each basket is twined with 2 and 3 strands. The Tlingit people believe that a spirit lived in all animate and inanimate objects, and the names of the decorative motifs in basketry were based historically on objects in their environment, such as the track of the snail in the mud, a zigzag pattern, or the mouth track of the woodworm that eats through the wood. Another zigzag pattern, but with a different pace to it. Wave patterns, salmonberry patterns, tree and shadow patterns, and tattoo patterns that also were tattoos on the body. Okay, so now moving to Terry's raven tail weaving. Weaving in the raven's tail style is an ancient Alaskan art that was made over about 275 years ago in the southeast region as well, in the northern part only. It was revived in 1990 by a group of dedicated weavers, and it is practiced today by a very small handful of devoted and talented fiber artists. Terry was one of these. Patterned in bold black and white designs, streaked with dashes of yellow. These robes have sort of longitude pattern stripes in a herringbone pattern, and that pattern was named Yilkuwu, which is translated as the raven's tail, because it resembles the veins of the tail feather of the raven. There are only 13 raven tail style weavings in existence in museum collections today. 2 of these are in illustrations, in fact. We don't actually have those objects, but we have images of them. And these are in early accounts and images such as this one. 4 robes are actually in Leningrad. These were collected in the 1700s at Latuya Bay, the homeland of Terry's family, and where they were recorded as being worn by the highest ranking Tlingit chiefs, like Chief Katlian here, illustrated in 1804 in Sitka. And the Russians, you remember Russia first dominated Alaska. 4 other robes are in Copenhagen, one in London, one in Toronto, in the United States, one at Harvard, which holds the most magnificent robe called the Swift robe, after a sea captain who collected this robe. Here it's illustrated on the left, a drawing. And there are fragments of other robes, only fragments, and one of those is here at the Penn Museum, 2 in the American Museum of Natural History, and 1 in Ottawa. So these are really rare. These raven-tail blankets are made traditionally with the wool of the mountain goat, who lives on the rocky cliffs of Glacier Bay. Specifically, this one cliff even has an oral history. This is the cliff that the women would climb up to gather in the spring pieces of this wool that had been sort of left in the spring by these animals on Chickagoff and Baranof Islands as well. So raven-tail weaving is made not on a loom, but rather with the warp simply hanging freely from a horizontal bar shown here in Terry's studio, and with the 2 and the 3 strands of the weft twining in exactly the same technique as the basketry that you learned about earlier. And it takes Terry about between 600 and 2,000 hours to make one robe. She took to heart the storytelling aspect of Tlingit material culture, and like the totem pole specifically, she weaves her textiles to record very specific histories that have happened in their own history. She felt very strongly about this, and each of her garments tells a very specific story. Of the 17 robes that she wove in her lifetime, and I'm just going to share a couple of these. This one is a dance apron, and it's in the collection here at Penn. And it in fact commemorates Terry's relationship with a New Zealand Maori weaver named Emily Schuster. She very specifically chose the design motifs because they link up and sort of talk about this shared language that weavers have across geography and through place. Raven's cradle design, steps to our ancestors for the Maori. But it's also, the same design is used by shaman, Tlingit shaman on their headdresses. And we don't actually have the name for, or the meaning of that word in Tlingit. This is a dance apron. It'll be worn around the waist. And it is mounted on the backing of very soft deer hide. It has sea otter fur at the top and deer toes at the bottom. So when this object is worn and danced, it makes a really beautiful rattling sound. This is the Anchorage earthquake robe that Terry made. The Great Alaskan Earthquake of March 27th, 1964 at 5:36 p.m., centered in Prince William Sound just to the north. It lasted for about 4 to 5 minutes, and the 9.2 earthquake caused 139 deaths. You see the break in the design. This is the garment in the middle. And you see at the bottom edge, Terry has illustrated this in a very specific way. By studying the earthquake itself, she did a lot of research, and she also has small lines of red, which actually, for her, represent the fires that burned on the water in the communities nearby. The gasoline just sat on the surface of the water. And in the left of this garment, in the vertical, you see some crosses. Those are crosses that commemorate the 139 people who died in that event. So Terry is working in a very deliberate way to tell a real narrative through her work. She did lots of research, as I said, and she studied the reports carefully. Here's an actual photograph of the railroad and the effect that the earthquake had there. She represents this on the right, around the neck, on the left part of on the proper right shoulder. So the garment on the right, on its left side, you see the train track and the curve that she has put in there, as seen in the photograph. At that event, ground fissures and collapsing structures, and there was a significant tsunami. This piece took her 700 hours to weave. And she completed it in 2004. So she lived in Anchorage as a child, as you remember, and she remembered the feeling of the quake. And she after she did this weaving for so many hours, she actually picked parts of it apart to sort of reflect the damage, this idea of the damage in the garment itself, to illustrate the breaks in the earth. She documented the fissures and the breaks and the curve in the railroad track and the crosses, noting the loss of life. At the bottom is the tsunami waves and the red on their tops with fires burning on the water in the region of Seward, the town of Seward. As the top edge bears the tracks, they're pressed down with these are bears' tracks, the black and white, what looks like checkered. These are bear tracks that press down, showing the weight of the animal. And this piece was actually purchased and is on display in the Ted Stevens International Airport in Anchorage, which was pretty exciting for her. Here's another piece that she made. This is the Latuya Bay robe that she made after coming to study the robe at Penn. She came here in 2003. And in Terry's thought process, a robe is never completed until it is actually danced. So many of the images that she shows of her work are the robes in fact dancing, so the spirit of the dance within them. So after careful research and planning, including a trip to Latuya Bay shown here from the air, she wove a new robe that literally twines together her personal story with those of her ancestors. So collapsing past and present, this robe tells the story of her two uncles who were actually fishing in Latuya Bay when another devastating earthquake and tsunami struck. She says, like a fishbowl, it sloshed back and forth before the water went back out into the Pacific Ocean. It took all the trees, all of the vegetation down to bedrock. More than anything, I feel like there are events in our lives today that are of legendary proportions, and we have a responsibility to record those things because we are making history. We're continuing to make history today, unquote. The fault lines run through her robe, and this also depicts the destruction and displacement of the land and the trees on the borders, which she left white. And in this instance, she combined historical events of this earthquake that occurred in both 1958 and 1964 with her own experience. And she actually gave this robe to her daughter. Here's a close-up of the robe. You can see some of the fault lines that she's put there. It's not the greatest picture. Okay, here's another robe on the loom still called the DNA robe. This one is made entirely of hand-spun mountain goat wool. For many of her garments, she's not gathering mountain goat wool for everyone. It's actually pretty rare these days. But this was her project, and it's about the mountain goat. Here you see the loom set up and the warp hanging, and this piece in process. You see her research notes as well. She's really into documenting her work. Here's Terry actually in this project about the mountain goat. She developed relationships with hunters and scientists conducting surveys and research on mountain goats, and many of them befriended her and ended up giving her the hides themselves so she could use them. So here she is in her driveway pulling the fur off the hide. She pushed for DNA analysis to track the goats and to determine the distinct population within particular regions on these islands. Here you see the final product, and she incorporated on your far left, you see a little you see a double helix of a DNA on her side border, her way of talking about the genetic history that she learned as she did this piece. So her art shares the healing that is going on in the Tlingit community, healing by regaining and revitalizing traditional practices and making them her own. She exemplified that drive, that endurance, and that persistence and energy. And this gets to the physicality of the robes and the baskets themselves, not only of their creation, but of their use. So her work is held in many museums and public spaces. It is also used ceremonially as regalia and dance attire in local ku'ik or potlatches, these memorial funerals that I mentioned, and of course by individuals. And in the context of Native Alaska, this is a healing from a long history of colonialism, of course. The legacies are still just so great in these communities. This is a history of assimilation, displacement, racism, segregation, and ongoing trauma that Native Alaskan communities continue to struggle with in really profound ways. Note that the sale and the removal of collections from Native communities themselves, like coming here to Philadelphia, also played a role in cultural assimilation. Understanding this context, Terry's choices and her work are in very much a part of the healing that is going on and that is vital to recovery for the next generation of young people since about the 1960s. The way she does this is through her insistence on staying in that place, working in that location at home. And at least she practices a partial subsistence lifestyle, as so many do on these islands. She remains there, she prioritizes and perpetuates her weaving practice through her teaching as well, and through her modeling for the young people in her community, and by being very distinctly and very deliberately a bridge to the non-Native community as well. So she teaches us as well. So I think that I want to take just a moment to talk about this issue of healing. I think it's very easy to sort of shrug off the notion of healing. Somehow we just hear the word and say, okay, you know, as outsiders, it's hard to appreciate that. But I think to examine this closely is really important, and it requires empathy and attention and acknowledgement of the personal tragedies of our American past. And I think that an anthropological perspective here is really helpful. There's a physicality to the healing from trauma that we need to acknowledge. The fields of nursing and medicine have definitely identified this, and they've done some really good work in this area, what they call heritage consistency and health traditions. They've developed new health tradition models that medical and nursing people are sort of getting their heads around. And they acknowledge in that what people do from a traditional perspective to maintain their health and to protect their health or prevent illness and or to restore their health. And in this model, health is a complex, interrelated phenomena balancing all facets of the person, the body, of course, the mind, and the spirit. So what I want to take just a moment to articulate is that these, because as outsiders, I think it helps us understand Terry's work. The body, of course, includes all the physical aspects like the genetic inheritance, the body chemistry, the gender, age, nutrition, and physical condition. The mind includes the cognitive processes such as thoughts, memories, knowledge of such emotional processes as feelings, defenses, self-esteem. The spiritual aspect includes learned spiritual practices and teaching, dreams. Terry dreams about this stuff, these textiles all the time. People are driven to as they dream, and this connects to her role as a healer, I think. Symbols, stories, gifts and intuition, grace and the protective forces as they see it, and positive and negative metaphysical or innate forces. So these facets are in constant flux and they change over time, yet each one is completely dependent and related to the others. And also system notifications. Something's going on, John, with your laptop. Maybe I can just get rid of it. Okay. So sorry, it went away. I think I did whatever I needed to do. You're walking here, did it? I don't know. Thank you. So, okay, so related to each other, but also related to this overall context of the person, okay? So the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. And in the outside, in the natural world, the family and the community as well. Okay, so for Terry, as we see in her work, her materials and also her creations retain and take on a life force. That life force comes from relationships to places and to beings in the world. She's paying attention to that, and this is a kind of spiritual journey for her, which for her and many others today is actually healing, okay, in a very literal sense. So this is essential for progress of Indigenous peoples today, regaining ownership of these places, their homelands, and their historic objects physically. It's really about regaining themselves and their lives in the process. So this is incredibly healing and strengthening for people in ways that we may find hard to understand. So you have to do this work yourself. You have to restore those connections and by restoring those connections of place and beings, that is the healing that comes. So as a teacher, this is what Terry's doing. And so to put this all together, in the end, I think you can speak about her as a healer and her art as healing. A kind of keen observer as part of that includes her sort of scientific or analytical bent as well. But I do believe that she is a kind of healer. There's definitely a humbleness about her that, and if you look closely at this image, this is a bunch of dead fish, okay? This is the stuff that she's always so excited about at this time of year right now when the salmon are spawning. They're coming back to lay their eggs, but essentially to die. And she really loved this time of year. So this sort of relays this native perspective of being a very small part in a very big world, in this world of relationships, situated in places and in the land. She loved this time of year, late summer, early fall, when the salmon are returning to spawn and their decayed bodies are failing them. They're all discolored and they're partly rotten, and you can actually smell this in the rivers. And as they struggle upstream to lay their eggs, then they die. So this is what the bears are feeding on right now, and as they prepare to hibernate and go in for the long winter. She took me there to see and smell this in early October. Struggling with her own cancer, she quietly hung 2 large black and white photographic prints of this scene on the wall in her bathroom one day, her husband told me, where she and her husband and her children would see these photographs every day as a reminder that, okay, she, but also all of us, are each just one small speck in this big cycle of life passing through. Okay, so Terry's teaching. Through her teaching, she's healing in other ways as well. She built bridges to the museum community of non-native scholars and practitioners, conservators and biologists, curators and scientists. She worked with a circle of weavers in her Tlingit communities. She taught weaving, spinning workshops in Cordova, Sitka, and Yakutat. She was an artist in residence at the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center in Sitka, the Native Heritage Center in Anchorage, Peabody Museum, Essex at Salem. The list goes on. She taught Raven's Tail weaving at Southeast. She did many lectures from Alaska to Minnesota to the Penn Museum. She helped develop respectful treatments by conservators at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of the American Indian, at Winter Tour Conservation Lab, and as the research associate here at the Penn Museum. She also worked with U.S. Fish and Game Department to protect the mountain goats on Baranof Island. She also offered important insights about how access to museum collections can serve as powerful agents to revitalize cultural practices. And through her process, her analytical interests have helped us ask better questions. She was a remarkable model of kindness, generosity, and sharing. And she most recently offered consultation and workshops at the National Museum in 2016. Close to home, she was also heavily involved in the Sitka School District, training teachers in summer programs and through the Sitka Native Education Program. She led hundreds of children into the woods, talking about culture and tradition, and she worked diligently to incorporate math and botany and sustainable harvesting methodologies so that the trees would be around year after year without damage. She taught a berry camp where Native children studied and handled old berry baskets and picked berries. She had an especially strong interest in developing curriculum around sustainability. She got some very coveted eco awards as well. Also, she focused on traditional practices and their intersection with science and math. Shown here with Rocco Landsman, chairman of NEA, and Mark Begich, the U.S. Senator of Alaska. In closing, in these sessions and at all of these sessions, Terry spoke to the artifacts as if they were alive here in Philadelphia and wherever she was. She helped broaden the experiences for those objects themselves as ancestors, and she very deliberately modeled that for others. So she challenged standard notions of tangible versus intangible care. And she had an incredible power and built bridges, I think, that strengthened the bonds within and outside the Tlingit community and between generations. So she had discussions, and her discussions helped safeguard the objects and their knowledge and their vitality. She also voiced her opinion on matters regarding repatriation of Tlingit human remains And while she was critical of some of the politics, the men essentially in her communities, she felt strongly about objects returning and becoming active again in the community. She believed that this helped strengthen the Tlingit worldview and that the objects themselves create the dialogue. So in this way, the old objects are initiating the dialogue now as they move forward. So throughout, her message has been about place and about a dynamic lifestyle in a very vast, strong land, which is much bigger than her. She always said that her materials kept her humble. Spruce root, cedar bark, and mountain goat wool were in fact her teachers, and her energy remains in her textiles. Through them, we can remember and touch her. Her Indigenous perspective broadens and strengthens, I think, the thrust of this conference. Yes, as a strong woman doing it herself, yet in Terry's case, her individual voice, yet in a profoundly deep partnership with the trees and the animals, the ancestor spirits, and the human beings around her, continuing a legacy for the women in her community, and with incredible resilience, helping heal and creating a pathway for the future. As she wished, her work amplifies a deep and timely appreciation for the teachings of the natural world and Indigenous material traditions, and in the Native community as well as the Academy. Thank you so much.
Well, welcome to the first of the afternoon sessions for this conference. My name is Kathy Peiss. I'm a faculty member here at Penn in the History Department, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speakers this afternoon in a session that is called Corresponding Women. The first speaker will be Suzanne Bordelon, who is professor and chair of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing Studies at San Diego State University. Her research interests focus on women's rhetorical practices and pedagogies of the late 19th and mid-20th centuries. She's the author of A Feminist Legacy, The Rhetoric and Pedagogy of Gertrude Buck, and she has a number of other articles that appear in a host of journals in rhetoric and writing. And she'll be speaking to us today on the topic is right on your screen, Private Letters for Public Audiences, the Complexities of Ethos in Louise Clapp's The Shirley Letters from the California Mines, 1851 to 1852. Tina Gianquitto is an associate professor of literature at the Colorado School of Mines. She's our second speaker. There seems to be a mines theme here. I don't know if that's intentional or not. Maybe that will come out in the course of these presentations. She is currently at work on two projects about plants, a digital project on plants and storytelling, and a book about the influence of Darwin's plant studies on responses to evolutionary theory in the U.S. She's written on American and British women naturalists, women and scientific correspondence networks, and Darwinism in the U.S. literary scene, and has received fellowships from the NEH, the ACLS, and the Fulbright program, and her talk today will be Off Alone on My Tramps on the Trail of Women Botanists in the Frontier West. After their presentations, I hope we'll have some time for discussion, questions, reflection. So look forward to this panel, and Suzanne will lead it off.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased and really honored to be here today. I'd like to begin by extending a heartfelt thank you to Carolyn Schimmel for inviting me to this conference and for sparking this research that I'll share with you today. Carolyn graciously allowed me to examine and draw on pieces from her private collection, some of what are on display in the case out there too, where you can see some of Clapp's original publications. So, and we're all here because of her amazing collection. And so I just wanted to extend a thank you to Carolyn today. Clap, clap. And just by way of disclosure, I'm not a Western historian. I feel a little bit out of my realm when I see and I'll note a lot of historians who have been here today. And I've really enjoyed the presentation by the historians, so I just wanted to thank you for your work. So my presentation today is part of a larger project that I completed on Louise Clapp. And I was also had a benefit from one of the people that Carolyn introduced me to yesterday, Carrie Streeter, who is also here today and has done some work on another woman we've looked at, Genevieve Stebbins. And Genevieve Stebbins is the niece of Louise Clapp. And so we've both traced this trail to Carolyn's house. And so it's been great to be able to connect with that. And she was able to show me this picture, and it should be A. Young with a space. It looks like it's not there. But so that's her when she's very young, before she went off. So in 1851, Louise Amelia Knapp-Smith Clapp, that's her full name, and her physician husband participated in California's gold rush, venturing to remote gold finding camps in the rugged Feather River region, and that's in far northern California, a very remote area. During her 15 months in the camps, Clapp detailed her experience in 23 letters, the Shirley letters from the California mines. Written to her sister in Massachusetts, but clearly intended for a broader audience, the Shirley letters, penned under the narrative persona of Dame Shirley, vividly and wittily detail Clapp's experience living in California gold mining camps with her husband, Fayette Clapp. Historians of California have long praised Clapp's The Shirley Letters, originally published serially in 1854-1855 in the Pioneer, or California Monthly Magazine, California's earliest literary magazine. In 1886, for instance, Josiah Royce, a California native who served as professor of the history of philosophy at Harvard, declared, quote, "These Shirley letters form the best accounts of an early mining camp that is known to me." Furthermore, Clapp's stories are thought to have sparked Bret Hart's The Outcast of Poker Flat and Mark Twain's Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Clapp's influence underscores the importance of women's accounts of life in the West, given that so few American women were there in California's formative years or wrote about it. And this is not Clapp, but it's a picture of women, one of the few women in the mines at that time. So although the Shirley letters have garnered attention, they remain unexplored from a rhetorical perspective. Clapp's letters are significant, though, because she uses the letter form in basically looking at private letters to her sister to reach public audiences, something that few other American pioneer woman writers at this time that we're seeing do. Furthermore, as one of the very few women living in the camps at that time, Clapp faced unusual material and social constraints. In fashioning her Dame Shirley persona, Clapp innovatively deploys her limited resources to indicate her own uniqueness as well as that of California. In my analysis, I examined both the creative rhetorical choices Clapp uses while also considering the various material and social constraints she faced. Recent reconceptualizations of ethos by feminist scholars help us to understand Clapp's contribution by assisting us in understanding the material, spatial, and relational aspects of the concept. One difficulty in analyzing ethos, though, according to Julie Nelson-Christoph, is that we are not used to reading it in any systematic fashion. And just by way of shorthand, traditionally, ethos has been associated with a writer's credibility. And often in the time period, it was talking about a public speaker, and it was often a man, and how that person gained their credibility. And so women who were not public speakers and who were not authors typically at this period had to use different ways in order to get their credibility or advance their credibility. And so, although significant work has been completed on ethos since Christoph's article, specific strategies for reading the socio-material aspects of ethos in an integrated manner still appear to have attracted little attention within the field of rhetoric and composition. Attempting to theorize uses of the personal in writing, Christoph examined published narratives of women pioneers who participated in and commented on Western expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States. The pioneer women Christoph studied intended to publish their narratives, but none published work in the letter form. By analyzing these texts, Christoph conceptualized what she calls strategies of placement, or the ways in which these and possibly other writers express and position themselves rhetorically. Strategies of placement posit both the specific resources a writer draws upon, but also the constraints that limit ethos construction. In addition to strategies of placement, Risa Applegarth's work extending contemporary genre theory to ethos construction is helpful in analyzing the appeal and parallels Christoph's conception. Applegarth recasts ethos as location within and among genre in an attempt to capture possibilities for, as well as limitation on a rhetor's capacity to shape ethos strategically. So she applies this understanding to her analysis of the work of Mary Austin, who was a nature writer, activist, and feminist in the early 20th century. Applegarth highlights the way Austin, a marginalized writer, was effectively able to construct her ethos within the challenging genre of the literary nature essay. So while acknowledging the different material and social constraints she faced, I highlight Clapp's resourceful response to these limitations. Such a study is significant because it reveals the way that Clapp uses, quote, the private genre as a vehicle for reaching her public audience. Doing so demonstrates the complexity of ethos construction, specifically the ways our socio-material surroundings reflect layered and multidimensional aspects of our identities. Clapp's education and experience, and this is just going into her background, prepared her well for her famous California Gold Rush letters. She was educated at female seminaries in New England, and she attended Amherst Academy. In addition, from 1839 to 1847, Clapp corresponded with Alexander Hill Everett, the older brother of Edward Everett, who was an orator, politician, pastor, and former president of Harvard. Equally talented, Alexander was a noted diplomat and writer who had edited the North American Review. So as a young 20-year-old, she met this diplomat on a stagecoach ride that lasted for 3 days, and then subsequently started corresponding with him for 8 years. And so she was getting kind of a education by letter writing in some ways. So described as a pillar of American intellectual life in the 19th century, Everett corresponded with Clapp until his death in June 1847. This experience not only familiarized Clapp with the letter writing genre, but also, given Everett's literary background and education, provided Clapp with a type of mentoring uncommon for women of her period. Through her correspondence with Alexander Hill Everett, Clapp gained an appreciation in and apprenticeship and understanding of the power and value of letters. For example, in their correspondence, Everett introduces Clapp to the celebrated letters of Madame de Sévigné and her correspondence primarily with her daughter during the reign of King Louis XIV. Everett and Clapp also discussed the life and work of Lady Mary Montagu in their correspondence. Thus, prior to writing her Gold Rush letters, Clapp is exposed to exemplars of the letter writing genre in her correspondence with this man. So in the Shirley letters, Clapp specifically draws on the travel letter, and I appreciated this discussion this morning, emphasizing sort of the influence of the travel letter genre by David, so that was nice. And it became particularly popular with women in the 19th century. Mary Suzanne Schreiber describes the travel form as historically a remarkably elastic genre. The travel book is a commodious and informal, a discontinuous form of writing similar to the journal, the memoir, the letter, and the diary, all of which women have produced from the earliest times. Clapp selected the letter form for her travel writing, most likely given her extensive experience with the genre. An example from the early 19th century that shares similarities to Clapp's Shirley letters is Catherine Maria Sedgwick's Letters from Abroad to Kindred at Home. For instance, both Sedgwick and Clapp write one-way epistolary letters rather than the conventional letter form, which is a two-way or multi-party exchange. That is to say, both address their letters to a recipient, but this individual is more a rhetorical construct than an actual respondent. Sedgwick addresses her brother, my dear C, and Clapp writes her sister Mary Jane or Molly or dear M. Although the letter genre includes certain constraint, Clapp makes productive use of this form. Furthermore, while she faced material and social constraints as one of few women living in the California mining camps, she paradoxically uses these limitations to enhance her credibility. While some historians have viewed the correspondence as private messages to her sister, as Marlene Smith-Berenzini has argued, Clapp did indeed compose these letters as conscious literary effort. Hence, Clapp's letters are highly performative, self-reflective, and strategic. Clapp is writing a letter to her sister in one sense, but she is creating a public ethos for her Dame Shirley persona. Using the travel letter genre framed as correspondence to her sister in Massachusetts allows Clapp to occupy the appropriate domestic space as Dame Shirley. As a mid-19th century, quote, lady, Clapp seemingly abides by expected gender constraints in not speaking publicly or promiscuously, to a multi-gendered audience, but converses within the appropriate domestic space to her sister. The letter home to her sister frame also creates a sense of intimacy and presence with her broader West Coast audience. In addition, the letter genre provides greater versatility than journalism. Furthermore, as I'll discuss, the rhetorical strategy of writing a one-way letter to her sister who never responds allows Clapp full control in terms of ethos construction, since no one can disagree with the way she portrays herself. Pretty smart. More significant, the letter format itself operates as a cover for and entree into the male domain of writing. So that is to say, it provides a means for Clapp to become a published author. In various ways, then, Clapp's selection of the letter genre seems highly strategic, given her previous experience and social expectations that she faced. As will become evident, Clapp is able to use the one-way letter genre and her material and social constraints to enhance her ethos, but also to suggest the complex, evolving nature of her identity, given her new context. We can better understand these aspects when we consider Clapp's letters in terms of Christoph's notions of strategies of placement, specifically identity statements and material associations. Christoph explains that identity statements are those places in the text in which a writer explicitly refers to some facet of her self-identity as a person affiliated with a particular place or community, say in effect, I am A. However, Christoph clarifies that these seemingly simple statements can be complex given that the writer's identity is always evolving based on the changing context that she faces. Material associations are references by writers to particular aspects of their material and social situation, and they figure prominently in Clapp's writing. Although Clapp letters include few I am A identity statements, they suggest her developing identity within her new California context. For instance, in her opening letter to Clapp, Dame Shirley constructs the imaginary musings of her sister Molly concerning her decision to come to California. I can figure to myself your whole surprised attitude as you exclaim, "What in the name of all that is restless has sent Dame Shirley to Richbar? How did such a shivering, frail, home-loving little thistle ever float safely to that faraway spot and take root so kindly as it evidently has in that barbarous soil? Where in this living, breathing world of ours lieth that same Richbar, which, sooth to say, has such a most taking name? And for pity's sake, how did the poor little fool expect to amuse herself?" So in articulating her sister's imagined astonishment, Clapp reveals a type of person she was prior to coming to California and introduces her Dame Shirley persona. By referring to herself as Dame Shirley, Clapp elevates the status of her narrative persona, inferring she is a woman of rank, authority, and education. At the same time, though, Clapp uses self-deprecating humor to poke fun at herself, suggesting that she is the last woman the reader would expect to find in a remote California mining camp. Clapp's statements also reveals what one can do with identity statements in a letter that one cannot do so easily in a narrative form as an unknown author. In the letter home to her sister form, Clapp can appear to be talking to someone who obviously already knows that she is a, quote, shivering, frail, home-loving little thistle. In other words, her ethos is pre-existing and established. Her comments simply solidify the point. Furthermore, the letter going in only one direction allows the writer to fully control the situation without anyone questioning her authority or self-portrayal. That is to say, the form allows Clapp to manage completely the construction of her ethos, with no chance of correction or clarification from the individual to whom she is writing. In her discussion of material association, Christoph explains that they are so prominent in the lives of speakers and writers that they receive little explicit commentary in the autobiographies that she examined. This point is also true in Clapp's letters. Material associations are particularly telling in terms of Clapp's ethos, given her remote context. Although her location in the mining camps is extremely limiting in a conventional material sense, Clapp makes creative use of what she has, what we in rhetoric would discuss as her available means of persuasion, to build her ethos. Clapp often resourcefully uses the material constraints she faced to emphasize her, quote, specialness. For example, she devotes significant space to describing her 20-foot square cabin in Indian Bar, which is adorned with makeshift furniture. And I'm not sure if 20 square feet would be right, because that would be about as big as a queen mattress, you know. So, but you can see the sense of how small these little cabins are. So my toilet table is formed of a trunk elevated upon two claret cases. The looking glass is one of those which come in paper cases for dolls' houses. The washstand is another trunk covered with a towel. I brought with me from Marysville a handsome carpet, a hair mattress, pillows, a profusion of bed linens, quilts, blankets, towels, so that in spite of the oddity of most of my furniture, I am in reality as thoroughly comfortable here as I could be in the most elegant palace. You know, hard to believe, but yeah. So in this passage, Clapp's seeming delight in her cabin's inventive decor is evident in her description. Catherine Halverson's observation on domesticity extend to Clapp's situation in that the details as presented not only describe her cabin, but also reflect Clapp. As Halverson explains, domesticity has long been central to expressing female gender in American culture. It follows then that women's life writers find wayward or fantastic housekeeping an ideal vehicle for making arguments about being special. Clapp's savor of makeshift cabin life confirms her success as a Westerner. That is to say, her details reflect on her own specialness in being able to appreciate and apply ingenuity and creativity given her limited situations. Given the highly rhetorical nature of the letters and the letter writing genre, this study suggests the richness of the Shirley letters and their potential for further analysis, particularly in terms of feminist rhetorical historiography. As we have seen, Clapp cleverly uses the letter writing genre, specifically the private letter to her sister, to reach public audiences. Furthermore, she often elevates her ethos by making creative and skillful use of various material and social constraints in the gold mining community. More significantly, in considering ethos in terms of social and material practices, this study provides a fuller, more multidimensional way of analyzing the concept, integrating Applegarth's understanding of genre with Christoph's strategies of placement allows us to comprehend Clapp's contribution to ethos construction. Given Clapp's use of the travel letter genre, her specific location, and her education, analyzing genre and material associations are particularly helpful in comprehending the affordances and constraints of ethos construction. In so doing, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of ethos. Focusing on the socio-material aspects of ethos allows us to grasp the ways Clapp, both consciously and unconsciously, uses these constraints in a skillful and imaginative ways that end up bolstering her ethos. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to add my thanks to everyone else's for all of you joining today. I'm very happy to have been asked to participate in this wonderful exhibition of women's encounters with the wilderness. The problem with going later in the day in a symposium like this is that I feel like I should just go home and rewrite everything to add all of the wonderful things I've learned. So with that, I'd like to talk to you today about 19th century scientific corresponding women. And these are women who participated enthusiastically in scientific studies and fieldwork, and who maintained networks of people who shared their passions. Epistolary networks were foundational to global intellectual life and had understandably long been seen as essential to the pursuit of scientific discovery. Darwin is always a great example for such things. He was a famously prolific correspondent. I mean, I think his extant correspondence right now is somewhere in the 15 to 18,000 letters. I mean, it's huge volumes. And it's long been acknowledged that an army of far-flung correspondents happily provided Darwin with the bits and pieces that, once put together, resulted in his theory of evolution. But perhaps even more, these scientific letters bridge distances between people via a specimen, typically, or a negotiation of a complex scientific idea. And writers found space, even in the most technical letters, to talk about personal triumphs and tragedies. In the process, they developed deep and abiding friendships. Archival correspondence files of professional scientists around the US contain troves of letters written by women, however, and provide a textured snapshot of the world of women's scientific engagement in the 19th century. But what is perhaps most extraordinary about the bulk of women's scientific correspondence is that, in many ways, it is not extraordinary at all. The extant correspondence of female naturalists, from amateur enthusiasts to academic professionals, shows them engaged, like their male counterparts, in a diversity of scientific pursuits across the sciences. Scientific literacy, of course, was the cultural currency of the day, seen as especially important for a rapidly transforming, increasingly technological nation. For both men and women, participation in science activities, such as flower collecting or weather recording, joining scientific societies, or even reading about scientific topics in magazines and newspapers, was seen as a form of profound civic engagement. And with the expansion of postal networks in the post-Civil War era, as well as a number of postal reforms that addressed the shipping of specimens in particular, scientific enthusiasts could more easily correspond with experts. So this cooperative observer system of 19th century scientific networks operated much like today's citizen or open science initiatives. If members of the public, male or female, young or old, rich or poor, had something worthwhile to contribute, they were welcomed into the networks. Although women participated in a range of scientific networks, they are especially prominent in the botanical sciences, partly, though not exclusively, because botany was a field suited to home study. There's a long history of women's involvement in the botanical sciences. Botany attracted all kinds of women for all kinds of reasons. A majority of corresponding women were true amateurs, leisure time botanizers seeking to engage experts as a way to increase their knowledge of science. These correspondents generally wrote once or twice, usually asking for an identification of an unknown specimen, for an autograph, or perhaps for a reprint of an otherwise inaccessible publication. And you see a lot of these letters, especially from women on the frontier, who just don't have access to the kinds of scientific, to the kinds of libraries that women in the East can find. Other women established lasting connections, writing many letters over the course of years and discussing a wide range of topics. At the opposite end of the spectrum were those women engaged in the scientific knowledge trade as a professional enterprise. And these are three of the better-known ones. These include professional naturalists sharing experimental observations, such as Darwin's correspondent and carnivorous plant expert Mary Treat. Oh, did they all get smushed together? They did. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Catherine Brandigy is the next person down, and she's a California botanist, Catherine Brandigy and Alice Eastwood, and commercial collectors such as Rebecca Merritt Austin, a miner's wife, and Mary Pulsifer Ames, a rancher. Both were living in the high Sierras at the time. And Alice Eastwood and Catherine Brandigy I'll be talking a little bit about later, too. They were both curators at the California Academy of Sciences. So some of these slides may have been smushed, so I apologize for that, and I'll just try to read what's missing. Okay, in some cases, letters written by both professional and non-professional women reveal intimate details of their personal tragedies. A late financial depression, an invalid husband, or the death of a son on whom we depended reveal a variety of motivations for undertaking paid scientific work. The majority of letters, however, are from women who fell somewhere in between these two poles, not fully amateur nor professional, but deeply invested in knowing about their local landscapes. This woman on the bottom, Rebecca Merritt Austin, I'll be talking about her more. She turned to professional collecting. She followed her husband to the mining camps of the Sierras, and he fell ill, and she turned to professional collecting as a way to supplement the family's income. So the letter writers that are not fully professional or not fully amateur, these might include teachers requesting specimens, requesting information for students. One woman wrote when her herbarium went up, quote, all in a flash. She wrote to Asa Gray at Harvard to request specimens for him and promised in return that she would give him roots of their native ferns. Right, so there's a real system of exchange there. Or scientific club secretaries sharing local discoveries. And one of my favorite exchanges comes from the Syracuse Botanical Society, a group of women who had been friends and colleagues for years. They disbanded in a flurry of dismay and hurt feelings. after one faction of the group refused to disclose the whereabouts of a coveted plant to the other faction of the group, preventing this other section of the group from getting these rare specimens themselves. And the different factions of the group actually wrote to the botanists at Harvard asking them to sort of negotiate this, to get into the fray, and they politely declined. They said, I'm sorry, we're not going to get involved. They even wrote to Darwin, too, and he was also a little bit, thank you, but... So such active pursuit of scientific interests enabled women to address the loneliness that often marked their lives. It enabled them to expand their networks beyond the home, to bond with others over a shared love of the natural world, and to create networks that encouraged and sustained all parties through long years. For some, isolation came in the form of geography, especially among those women writing from the frontier spaces of the U.S., many of whom took to botanical study to stave off the boredom of rural life after relocating from eastern cities. For others, intellectual isolation arose, even among those in cities, from having few around who shared their scientific interests. This understanding that women botanists were seeking a, quote, sympathetic audience for their ideas about science can help explain other, more personal dimensions of letters and correspondence networks. To write a letter, to post it, and to reply to letters received was to forge a bond across space and time, and to participate in a communal enterprise that transcended mere knowledge trade. These are herbarium specimens that were often enclosed in letters, and you can see how beautiful these specimens are and how real works of art. You can find herbarium specimens. Many of them are being digitized. Harvard has an amazing collection. The Biodiversity Library has an incredible collection. I highly recommend just looking at them as an art form. Enclosures in letters, pressed flowers such as these, insects. Ants were really a popular study, and people sent vials of ants. Just as an aside, Auguste Forel in Switzerland was one of the leading myrmecologists of the time, and he has these notebooks recording specimens that were sent to him. And at first, when he first starts out, he has like a page or a half a page per specimen. And then after about 15 years, he has this in this cramped handwriting, first one line and then a half a line, filling notebook after notebook after notebook. And these were ants that were sent to him through the mail. So specimen lists, seeds, books, copies of articles, and especially personal items such as signed photographs were vital elements of letter networks and enabled correspondents to compress the vast distances that often separated them. Emigrants to frontier outposts, for instance, would send native plants, along with entertaining accounts of their discovery, to correspondents, evoking for them remote landscapes and even more remote experiences. Enclosures of a more personal nature, especially photographs, stood in for the correspondent's physical presence, binding, quote, distant friends in sympathy, as postal reformers argued. And words, specimens, and photographs combined to create an image of intimacy and friendship amidst scientific exchange. So this is one of my favorite exchanges of photographs, which can be found in a series of mid-1870s letters from Emily O. Pelton, who had moved from Massachusetts to California, to George Davenport, a Boston store owner, botanical writer, conservationist, and bellow fern collector. I should like to place your face before me, would prefer to have the real to the representative one, but a photograph is the next best. In a later letter about the identification of collected fern specimens, Pelton metaphorically reaches out to hand the plants to Davenport. My photo you will find enclosed among the ferns, and could it speak, would give you a friendly, warm greeting with a warm grasp of the hand. It's so lovely to imagine this photograph packed inside these fern specimens, and as he peels the layers of fern specimens out, he finds her photograph. Women also wrote lively, entertaining letters rich with details, with tales of adversity and adventure, even if the adventure was made up of heading off a beaten path, and the adversity consisted in tangling with briars that, quote, clutched, tripped, and seemed determined to do all in their power to prevent finding the hidden treasure. Almeda Hodge Barrett of Oregon described an expedition into Mount Hood in one letter to the most famous botanist in the U.S., Asa Gray. Collecting at 3,000 feet above sea level and 500 feet above snow line, which doesn't exactly make any sense. 500 feet above snow line would be in the air. But anyway, she ascended and descended steep slopes and high ridges in pursuit of specimens. To reach one plant, she was, quote, obliged to climb a steep bank just where the snow had melted, leaving a yawning fissure a foot or 18 inches wide. Slipping, I only saved myself by springing over the chasm just as I saw I must go. Even though she was, quote, sorry to find that after such danger the procured specimen was nothing new, Gray nevertheless rewarded Barrett's courageous collecting by naming a local Hood River plant after her, and that's the penstemon. There's this picture of it there, and that's the herbarium specimen that she sent in of the penstemon. Many of the letters between collectors, enthusiasts, and botanical professionals illuminate these bonds of both knowledge and sympathy, and letters frequently mix requests for identifications or specimens with consolations about illness, fatigue, and overwork, especially with George Davenport. He must have been a very sympathetic person because the letters that he shares are really sort of deeply encouraging. Quote, we are in this together, commercial collector Rebecca Austin reminded John Gill Lemon, an ailing Civil War veteran, when offering to help him secure specimens for sale in the High Sierras. This sense of commercial collectors banding together, especially in frontier spaces, can be seen in a number of places. Another Californian collector, Mary Pulsifer Ames, also sought to help Lemon, writing to George Wilson, a prominent Eastern horticulturalist and commercial nursery proprietor. Quote, the wretched state of his health wholly unfits him, we think, for any occupation except botanizing, which keeps him a great deal in the open air and proves a healthful and diverting recreation for his mind. He was one of the victims of our late Civil War, was almost literally starved to death in that disgraceful death pen of Andersonville. And there's a great collection of letters with John Gill Lemon and his wife Sarah Plummer that are housed at the Jepson Libraries at UC Berkeley. Sympathy abounds in the letters, largely in keeping with the era's understanding of sympathy as both the start and end point of the study of the natural world. Liberty Hyde Bailey, a leading proponent of nature study, argued that, quote, nature study is seeing what one looks at and drawing proper conclusions from what one sees. And thereby the learner comes into personal relation and sympathy with the object. As historian Jim Endersby explains, sympathy for nature was intimately bound up with sympathy for the joys and sorrows of life that were often part of many epistolary exchanges. When Austin queried Catherine Brandigee about the receipt of a package of specimens, for which, significantly, she had yet to be paid, she frames her question in concern for Brandigee's health. Dear friend, she opens the letter, I sent you a package of specimens some time ago and should have heard from you ere this. I hope you are not sick. In an earlier letter, Brandigee had complained to Austin that she had been unable to sleep. Austin had replied, quote, I am sorry to hear of your suffering from insomnia. I can fully sympathize with you as I have been a great sufferer at different times in my life from the same cause. At the end of her letter, Austin reiterates her concern, quote, hoping to hear from you soon and that you are well. I remain your sincere friend. Austin also deploys sympathy for her own ends here, politely providing Brandigee with the convenient excuse, illness, for her delinquent payments, while making a claim on those payments nonetheless. In spite of their successes, I'd be remiss, especially in this era of Me Too, if I failed to talk about the real problems scientific women faced when they went, quote, off alone on their tramps. Their perseverance and understatement in retelling the dangers they faced is remarkable, especially from the vantage point of the 21st century. Austen recounted a recent expedition she took with a woman friend to Catherine Brandigy. Quote, much credit is due Mrs. J.C. Largent for her help in making this collection. She is a brave and noble woman. We traveled 300 miles in the Cascades alone, and she managed the team. Despite their collecting successes in the expedition, Austen is circumspect. I enjoyed the trip, but do not want to make it again unless my husband can go with me. It is not safe. There are too many wild animals and desperadoes. I always thought I was brave, but I was afraid on several occasions on this trip. That's from 1893. Alice Eastwood, one of the most prominent botanists of the late 19th century, was known throughout the botanical world as an ambitious and courageous collector, and very funny too. Eastwood often traveled alone or with male and female scientific companions into the remotest areas of the West. She regularly carried a pistol and had modified her clothing for the field, devising an ingenious systems of buttons to turn split skirts into pants suitable for hiking and riding. Nevertheless, Eastwood wrote Brandigy for advice in the face of a particular, quote, quandary she encountered during the planning of a long-awaited expedition to Mineral King, California. I had planned all summer to go to Mineral King in September. I wrote to Visalia to inquire about the stage and have learned that the stage no longer runs there. At Three Rivers, the only place to stay is at the house of an old widower with grown-up and small children. I stayed there in the spring. He made love to me, and though I snubbed him, he even wrote to me after I returned, asking if he might come to see me. I did not reply, but I can't go there again, and I'm afraid I'll have to give it up. What a nuisance sex is. Although Eastwood chalks the episode up to the, quote, nuisance of sex, she nevertheless registers the real restraints placed on her scientific pursuits that result only from that sex. Eastwood places this episode in the broader context of women's rights by prefacing the story in the letter with the news of the departure from California of their mutual friend, the British suffragist and education reformer Mary McRoberts, at the behest of her husband. As Eastwood notes, quote, the cause of women suffers a great loss when she leaves. Eastwood likely knew she was writing to a sympathetic audience. Brandigy was clearly attuned to gender concerns in her own position. She once opened a letter to a fellow curator of the Gray Herbarium, saying, your letter to the curator of the Herbarium of the California Academy of Sciences, dear sir, has much amused me. After having been its curator for 8 years, she reminds him, I am, dear madam. Both gender considerations and classification concerns, technical taxonomic classification concerns, shaped Brandigy's career. She took a degree in medicine after her ex-husband, Hugh Curran, a reputed drunkard, died, saddling her with debts that she paid upon his death in 1874. Curran found it difficult to establish a practice as a female doctor, and instead, perhaps remarkably from our perspective, turned to botany to support herself. As noted, Curran, later Brandigy, was attuned to gender considerations in her letters with colleagues. An especially interesting example comes in an 1884 exchange between Curran and Gray. Apparently, Gray had proposed naming a species after Curran. She thanked him somewhat half-heartedly in a, quote, nearly forgotten postscript. My own name is Lane, she tells Gray, quote, and I would prefer to have so called any plant which you may kindly call after me. Although Gray's original letter and reply were lost when the Academy collections were destroyed following the earthquake and fire that hit San Francisco in 1906, we can reconstruct something of the conversation in Curran's subsequent letters to Gray. He must have asked for clarification, as Curran replied, I answer in this your previous letter as well as the last, and will try to explain myself in respect to names. Her response is worth quoting at length. In the first case, I do not greatly care for them, and if a genus is to be named for me, I would prefer it to be after my death. In the next place, your Borgeranus plant, which is that one right there, is altogether too unsightly, and I hereby wish it distinctly understood that no plant which is of an ill smell, covered with prickles, or of which the fruit stands on its head, is to be christened after me. I should not like such an erroneous opinion of my appearance and habits to become current. In regard to scientific names, your argument that one must either be married or single hardly covers the ground. Whom the gods wish to destroy, they must first make mad. And who knows, but I might tomorrow take it into my head to marry a man named Smith. What would you do for a species named for me? Smithay? Therefore, please evolve a generic name for your homely weed out of your inner consciousness. And if out of your kindly feeling you sometimes wish to name a species for me, call them Lane. Such a great reply. Curran's reply is both acerbic and witty, but she deploys humor to make a serious point about power and powerlessness. Having already been divorced, she's clearly aware of both the contingencies of marriage, as she says, take it into my head, and in contrast, of the lasting nature of scientific nomenclature. She is also clearly aware of the well-established deployment of botanical nomenclature as a tool of ridicule for scientific rivals. It is thus significant that Curran requests that if Gray insists on naming anything after her, he would do so under her, quote, maiden name. As Nancy Walker notes in her influential study of American women's humor, the woman who uses humor to point out absurdities in oppressive social systems, quote, is at odds with the publicly espoused values of the culture. In this case, both women's subordination to the marriage system and her expected acquiescence to scientific authority. Who would think of arguing with Asa Gray when he says, I'd like to name something for you? And she says, nah, I don't think so. Like the humorist, Curran, quote, breaks out of a passive subordinate position, even though doing so she risks alienating those upon whom she may be dependent. Here, Asa Gray. At the same time, the subject of her humor, namely her feminine appearance, highlights her awareness that that appearance simultaneously marks the source of both her marriageability and her exclusion from the scientific arena. Gray must have had some sense of both humor and awareness. He obliged, creating the genus Lane, which you see in the corner there, using Curran's maiden name. As an aside, Mary Curran did marry again in 1889, and she completely changed her name. She became known throughout the botanical world by the name Catherine Brandegee. Catherine Brandegee and Alice Eastwood are exceptional in the world of 19th century scientific correspondence. Both occupied important positions that required voluminous correspondence with scientists around the country. As a result, their correspondence files have been more comprehensively preserved in archives than is typical for women science practitioners of the period. They also offer the most comprehensive examples of the kind of botanical exchanges that women engaged in during the latter part of the century. A majority of women's scientific correspondence in the 19th century does not fall into this category. Women's scientific letters, many of which exist only in the archives of notable scientific men and institutions, can be read according to the terms that Susan Scott Parrish establishes in her powerful reading of the archive. They are both, quote, they are examples of both the, quote, simultaneous losses of the historical record, displaying instances of what has not been collected, right? So these letters that exist in these archives show what hasn't been collected, as well as that which has been unintentionally preserved, what Parrish beautifully calls the accidental stowaway inside the historical vehicle, in this case, of the papers of scientific men of the 19th century. The fact that we find a great many stowaways in the archives indicates that women participated fully in the scientific communities of the 19th century, engaging in different types of scientific correspondence and largely following the conventions of their male colleagues in establishing and maintaining scientific networks. The found letter makes the efforts of scientific women visible, but only because, quote, no originary collector or latter-day archivist particularly took note of it or bothered to exclude it. And yet, what is simultaneously lost is the sense that correspondents were engaged primarily in conversation with each other. Contrary to what one might expect, the letters of often obscure female correspondents have been preserved in the files of important scientific figures, but the replies of those prestigious scientists, in all but a few notable cases, no longer exist. Most epistolary exchanges between male and female botanical correspondents are not exchanges at all, as in many cases the archive only records a one-way conversation. We can only see women replying to unknown questions or comments, and we are left reconstructing a silence. Thus, the richness of epistolary relationships of the kind we see collected in the collected volumes of Charles Darwin's correspondence, for instance, are largely, quote, inaccessible in the archival record because such gaps have rendered them lost and or forgotten, as Parrish says. The contours of just what is lost can be seen in those few places where both sides of the conversation exist, where we witness scientists and science workers, fathers and mothers, men and women, querying each other about the mundane and intimate in the midst of matters of science, with humor or acerbity, or more often, compassion bound together. And I'd just like to end by thanking Caroline Schimmel for helping to reconstruct the silences of the archives by bringing together this beautiful collection. So thank you.
So Suzanne and Tina, thank you both for wonderful presentations. We're going to take a little time into the coffee break just so that there's a chance for you all in the audience to ask questions and have comments about this work. So raise your hands, and there's microphones going around.
Okay. Suzanne, so I was wondering about the extent to which Clapp's letters really are letters. And you cited the example of Catherine Sedgwick's Letters from Abroad to Kindred at Home. And she wrote letters to her family, which are not that book. And all of her correspondence before publication refers to the publication of her journals. She kept a journal, and those are heavily edited versions of her journal. And they're only marked Dear C. There's nothing about the family, about her brother Robert, whose terminal illness is the reason they are traveling all around Europe to try to revive him. They're really kind of not letters at all, but it almost seems to have been the publisher's choice. But I'm just wondering whether you know anything about the production of these texts or how she thought of them in that way.
Clapp's text, before she went up to the mine, she actually contacted the Marysville newspaper and actually published under the pseudonym of Dame Shirley. And then when she came back from the mines, divorced her husband, and went back to her, the same publisher, and then published. So there is kind of a documented idea that she saw these as publications in newspapers. So I'm not sure if I've addressed your question, but that's. Yeah, are they styled as letters? They are styled as letters, yeah. As I said, she was very familiar with the letter writing genre, and as I said, she had plenty of time up in the mines because she had a servant. She didn't have to she didn't have to wash her clothes. She didn't have to cook. So she did have a lot of time to be able to write and fashion her letters. And then, as I said, when she came down, you got the sense that she recopied them and brought the bound letters back down to before they were published.
Do any of those manuscripts survive, though?
Carolyn, the ones that were just printed in the California magazine are the ones that we have, and there's several original copies that she signed of those, her own copy. So.
Other questions, comments?
Anyone else?
I'll ask a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Kate, sorry.
Another question for Suzanne. Did you say that, make myself visible, that the letters were supposedly addressed to her sister in Massachusetts?
Yeah.
I was curious about that idea that she's writing back east, but her readers are in California. And I was wondering if you could say something more about how she addresses that.
She's introducing the East Coast audience to California, in that sense, too, that this is she's making aware. So I do see her audience as being, obviously it's published initially in California, but you do get that sense that she has this broader sense of audience of East Coast as well. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. So, but definitely very aware of audience on multiple levels. Yeah.
Question right here.
I've always wondered about the publication itself and how much of an East Coast audience it had, what was the circulation, because after they were published there, they were not published as a book for decades. So, I mean, you referenced people talking about them as the best letters ever, but was that after they were gathered together, or was that from the periodical
No, I
publication?
think it was after the publication, yeah.
You mean the second? I mean, the first gathering.
Well, I'm trying to think of when Josiah Royce wrote on that, and that was in the 1890s. And so I can't remember what the first publication of her letters were. So Josiah Royce is writing before that, so, yeah.
So, there's right
Yeah.
there.
Here.
Okay.
I had a question about the Sierras and the plant collecting. Were there any men that were also working? And if so, have you compared sort of the strengths or weaknesses of differences of the collections between the men and women? I'm just thinking about the woman's eye and details, and what was so special about that? I imagine it was special, but I wonder if you could comment on that. And yeah, so I think that's it.
Yeah, so there were male collectors, of course. John Gill Lemon was one of the most well-known of the California collectors. Mostly when scientists were able to participate. There were several expeditions that went to the west, and some of the botanists at Harvard in particular were able to choose people to accompany those. They were always men. In terms of the quality of specimen production, it really depends, because creating a beautiful specimen was a goal of many collectors, male and female. I think that's what was so striking to me, is that I was really expecting to find some sort of very distinctive differences between male and female collectors, and there really weren't many. I mean, possibly the men were able to didn't have as many domestic constraints upon them, but when you look at Alice Eastwood or Catherine Brandigee did a lot of her collecting with her husband. And their collections are extraordinary on both sides, right? So there really, I mean, there were some of the obvious limitations in terms of how women could get out, but in terms of the product, there really wasn't. It's an interesting question, though.
I just have a quick question, sort of thinking about your presentation, Lucy, before lunch, sort of Indigenous women's botanical knowledge, right, which is extensive. Are any of the, and clearly anthropologists are talking to Native women, but are any of these herbarium collectors talking to Native women, or are the women who you're talking about talking to Native women, right? Does any of that Indigenous knowledge come in here in even more stowaway fashion, right?
That's a really good question. I have to think about that for a minute. My first answer is no, not obviously. And I'm trying to think if there are some collectors that may have. See, part of the problem is that there's not a huge body of work to look at. So finding these letters is really difficult. It's getting easier now that there are better, sort of the collecting aids are a lot better, but not that I know of. The place where I might look would be Sarah Plummer Lemon, who's married to John Gill Lemon. It's possible that Brandigee did as well with her travels with Towns and Sith. those would probably be the two places that I would look. But that's later in the century, though. And so earlier in the century, there are very few women who are collecting. It's mostly a late 19th century activity in the West. It's mostly a late 19th century activity.
I wanted to ask a quick question, or not maybe a bigger question about money. A little bit about in terms of the clap letter, but perhaps more so for Tina's wonderful work of recovery. But you mentioned the commercial collecting in passing, and I am curious about the economies of that. I'm also curious if clap was paid and how much, if we know. But this bigger question of are women, is this an economy for women that is substantial? You alluded to that, and I'd love to hear more about either aspect.
There's a sense that, clap came from money. Her parents died, though, early, and she did have somebody who was, controlling her estate and paid for her education. But when she came down from the mines, she went to San Francisco and became a teacher. And so you did have the sense that she was restricted. And she wrote an article in the newspaper about how low teacher pay is. So you do get the sense that she might have been supplemented. She took in Genevieve Stebbins, who became an elocutionist, and that was her niece. And Genevieve Stebbins' father was a lawyer, and so you get the sense that maybe she was given some money for doing that. But definitely money, I think, was a concern because she was not paid a lot as a teacher in the school system.
So there's actually a surprising amount of talk of money in the letters of the professional correspondents. Rebecca Merritt Austin, certainly. There's a fantastic exchange with Mary Treat, who actually was one of the very, very few women who made her living exclusively through magazine writing, naturalists writing nature articles in the 19th century. And she had sent in an herbarium specimen to Gray, asking them to confirm that this was a new species that she had found. And they went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and they kept saying, no, it's not, you need to send us another example, blah, 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 blah. So finally she writes this very caustic letter that says, hey, you sitting there at Harvard with your salary, do you have any idea how much it costs me to create these herbarium specimen sheets? And then she proceeds to tell them exactly how much it costs her, including the postage. And very shortly after that, they resolved the issue and indeed do credit her with discovering a new species, and then the Harvard botanists name it after her. So there is talk of negotiations. There's a lot of talk with Austin and Brandegie about, okay, I'll give you this much, and I'll get this much from you. And there are also very interesting letters of competition. So Catherine Brandegie writes to Austin and says, hey, I heard that you were giving some of your collection to this other reviled botanist. You're jeopardizing your position with me as a collector. And Austin writes back and says, I don't know where you heard this, but that's not what happened. So there's a tremendous amount of negotiation, economic negotiation in the letters. Really interesting stuff.
So let me make a comment listening to your papers, and I will say at the outset I knew nothing about any of this before hearing you, and it was really a great pleasure to learn about the botanists as well as Louise Clapp, and now I want to know more. But what strikes me in listening to your talks is that there's a certain kind of almost schizophrenia in the representation of these women in their correspondence. If the correspondence itself is about, in part, representing the self, on the one hand, you have Louise Clapp, who has this, partially kooky, I was frail, you knew me as this, and kind of wrapping herself up in a way of, well, I can be understood in terms of traditional women, and yet I am doing this activity. And in Tina's case, the botanists are, they're not really talking, I mean, they are referencing gender in some very interesting ways, but mainly in terms of, not having the same advantages, but they are seeking to be equal players with the professors at Harvard and the like. So I'm wondering how you explain that, like just stepping back from your specific cases. And initially I thought, is this a matter of time period? Initially your botanists seemed to be later 19th century, but in fact, not all of them were. Maybe it has to do with the very subjects that they are engaged in. One, mining, in the mines, and which is much more perhaps heavily gendered male compared to botany. I don't know, so I'm asking you, can you put these two together in some way for me, or speculate a little bit about how they relate to each other?
Well, I think they were both savvy about how they were representing themselves in letters. And I think they also had that broader sense of an audience, and that they were maybe establishing something that would be read in the future, too.
I think for some of the women, they want to establish their bona fides, their credibility, and there's a difference there, I think, when you get into the amateurs and the professionals. So the amateurs have, the letters are sort of, please help me. Like, I don't know how to do this on my own. And then a lot of those people actually establish these really long correspondence. So I think it really depends on the position of the writer, what they're seeking from the person that they're writing to. If that helps at all.
So I'm thinking maybe we need to wrap up right now. Thank you very much. Could we